Hello there. We're in Germany again today, and we're in a lovely little place called Dinkelsbuhl, which is a really splendid name, isn't it? Very pretty town. One of the 3 pretty towns in a line that start with Rothenburg, which is classic urban sketcher's haunt, artist's haunt really. It's like a perfect little medieval style village. But Dinkelsbuhl is one south from there, and Nordlingen one south from there. So you can do these 3 villages in a couple of days, in a very happy couple of days, if you're a sketcher. And you have things like this lovely little gatehouse called the Wornitztor gate. One of the 3 or 4 gates they have in the city. I think the majority of it is 1450 as far as completion is concerned, but actually seems to go back earlier than that. The bottom part with the arch is back in the 12s. So this is genuinely old. And still does its job. You know, it's still, cars still drive through it. It still has that sense of doing a job of being the gatehouse to this little medieval town. Now we're using Yupo paper today. Now Yupo paper is super interesting. It's a polypropylene, and it's something that I enjoy experimenting with. It isn't something I recommend to everybody because it's basically polypropylene, meaning plastic. Meaning whatever you use, whatever watercolour you use, it doesn't dry into the paper, he said in inverted commas. It sits on top. And you can see here, that kind of wet, streaky kind of mark is because the fluid, the watercolour, is just sitting on top of the surface. It's not soaking up. And it literally has to kind of dry. And that's completely dependent on the weather and the day and the sun and humidity, all those kinds of things. So in the case of this drawing, it took half an hour, I guess, after it was finished, before it was completely dry. So I'm walking around Dinkelsbuhl carrying this wet painting around with me, this wet sketch, trying not to bash it against people, which was very annoying. Anyway, in other words, Yupo paper is probably not the best paper for or when you're out and about, unless you've got, if you've got your car with you and you can chuck it on the back seat, it's great. And frankly, it's the kind of thing I would use for landscapes before I'd use it for urban sketching. In fact, you can see the way the marks work. They're going to feel right for some kind of organic shape. If you're doing distant trees or fields or bushes, that kind of thing. Vegetation, it loves because you can just push the paint around in a way that kind of gathers and bubbles together in a way that feels very organic and very, veg-like, very tree-like. But doing buildings, it's not its natural choice, not the natural choice for buildings. Therefore, I sometimes choose it because I like to discover new things and take a risk. I like to surprise myself and not be bored. So I pay the price for that sometimes. And we see in this one, this is an interesting conclusion. It's quite poppy and arty in a way that's not quite like most things I do. And that's largely the paper. It's not particularly me. It's because all the colour that I lay on doesn't fade away. When you paint strong colours into tonal paper, there's an element of soaking in, as you'd expect. It's paper, so it soaks in. But when you paint onto this plastic, then it's sitting on the surface and the intensity of the colour is maintained. So sometimes the result can be very poppy, if you know what I mean by poppy. As in really pop arty, I suppose. Now I wanted to show you my ridiculously awful watercolour management, by which I mean don't learn from me and how I use my watercolours, because I am a contaminator. Sounds dramatic. What that means is you'll see that little palette. That's a little Winsor & Newton Cotman palette in which I put in some Daniel Smith watercolours as well. A couple of different colours just for, mix. And I have a very casual use of them. You'll see me bashing that brush around and basically taking a brush that has one colour on it and putting that brush onto another colour so that I'm literally contaminating and not caring. But at the end of the day, I might clear off the palette so that all the contamination can be washed away. But during the day, the contamination is just who I am. It's not something I'm worried about. I don't worry that I reach for a blue and it's got a bit of red in it, or I reach for a white. You can see a white there that's got blue in it. That doesn't worry me because I'm not looking for purity and perfection, because purity and perfection seems prissy and precious, and I'm trying not to be those things. I'm trying to be loose and casual and free. So the contamination is part of that process of freeness, of not being kind of tight inside, of not being all cautious and careful. Now, if you look at any proper watercolor artist on YouTube, they'll show you a very sort of precise watercolor management process where you don't cross-contaminate, where you don't just, wildly blend your colors together as if you're in some kind of sprint race and get all your colors mixed up and splosh all the color about and make a mess. They'll show you a much more controlled and cautious and precise process by which your colors maintain integrity. And well done them. And I wish I'd learned from proper people like that. I was self-taught, and the lesson I learned was, I can't be bothered with that. It just seems like too much. I was going to say too much effort. That makes me sound lazy, and I'm clearly not lazy, but you know what I mean? It seems like the wrong kind of thing to think about. What I want to think about is having colour on my brush and putting that colour down. I mean, I'm about to use ink, and I couldn't put my brush into the ink jar. The actual head, the opening of the jar was too narrow, so I'm just pouring ink into my watercolour, and in a minute I'm about to mix watercolour into the ink. Now this is silly. It's, ink and watercolour, two different things, and you shouldn't be mixing them in this way. But that's part of the joy for me. I mean, I come back to the same point I guess I make every time I ever do a video, which is it's sketching. And sketching is experimental and exploratory. And that means, from my point of view, anything goes, literally anything goes, and there are no limits. And maybe in doing some things which are wrong, I find something that works for me. And so the blue, for example, this ink going on top of this watercolor, which is not drying on top of this polypropylene Yupo paper, this for me is like revelatory. I'd never done it before. I'm doing it live, sitting on the ground in this little town, doing this 600 and something year old building or tower. And it all feels exciting and alive, It feels vital, as in, there's a kind of heartbeat going on, because there's no predictability. I don't know whether there's going to be some kind of conflict between these materials. The ink might spool or bleed or misbehave in a way that I'd have to deal with live on the sheet. I haven't done testing, I haven't done swatching, and I never would, because that takes away the drama, I guess, the excitement of doing it live. I guess it's, again, bad analogies. I'm famous for bad analogies. But, when an actor gets up on a stage, and if you see them being interviewed, they'll imply that each of the performances they give is slightly different, because they're just making little adaptations, emphasis on certain words, where they stand on the stage, that it isn't like a film where you can watch the film 20 times and it's exactly the same thing every time. It is, if you see 20 performances, they're 20 subtly different performances. And that's how I feel about sketching, where you could sketch the same thing and obviously every time it would be different. And that's something you are really looking for. It's not about maintaining some kind of set standard or following some kind of rules, self-imposed rules. In fact, I quite like it if I had all my sketches lined up on a wall, in a gallery, for example. I'd quite like it for somebody to walk around and go, oh no, this is all different people. That would be, I guess, my ultimate. In fact, that would be brilliant, because that shows something very interesting. I think that sense of I'm not trying to repeat myself, because even those words make me feel queasy. The idea of repetition. I am actively looking for variation, and in variation, discovery, and in discovery, I don't know, something that makes me happy. Now, you will note no pencil guidelines here, because polypropylene isn't something you want to have a pencil line on and rub off. Oh, by the way, I'm often asked, do I have a rubber? Do I have an eraser? To which the answer is sometimes if I remember, but often no, because I use them so rarely. I find them pointless to carry around, because they just take space up in the bag. So actually on this trip I didn't have an eraser because I don't know, I just don't see the purpose in them. I'd rather be lightweight with my pencils. I mean, you've seen me do a couple of sketches with pencil guidelines, and the pencil guideline at the end is just taken into the overall image. No one kind of looks at it and is offended by the pencil being there. And in the case of this drawing, there is no pencil, and therefore it's free in my eyes anyway. So it's like a true ink sketch where I've just gone straight in with the mop-headed brush with watercolour in a big sort of sploshy discovery kind of a way, and I'm looking at the gatehouse, this tower ahead of me, and I'm looking at my paper, and I'm doing the best I can, and I'm happy with that. I'm happy with doing the best I can. I know it's not going to be 100% precise, because it couldn't be. In a billion years it couldn't be. I know that the windows aren't going to be in exactly the right proportional positions, etc., etc. You know, if I often say, if in like a, I don't know, 1,000 years time and everything's fallen apart, somebody finds a big collection of my sketches, please don't try to rebuild the world based on those drawings, because they're not going to be accurate. They're not designed to be accurate. They're designed to be a flavour, a feel, and a response, and fun, and something that people recognise what I'm actually trying to sketch, but not in a way that feels as if it's overly precious, it's taking too much time, and it's really some kind of architectural challenge. You know, I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to do something that is just exciting for me as much as anything else. And if anybody looks at the image and says, oh, I can feel the excitement, then that's a double win as far as I'm concerned, because that's, you know, that's the ultimate goal, I think. Somebody looking at a drawing and not just saying, you've drawn that well, or, I don't know, something about the technique. I want somebody to feel something, literally, you know, emotional, feel some sense of interest or connection with the subject. So no pencil, straight in with a mop brush, get the basic forms down, then slightly more precise with an angled shader brush, just to kind of bring a bit of precision in order to kind of start to put the sort of the basic structural lines in. I'm doing that with a darker red, and then going in with the blue ink in order to punch in things like the window reflections and the cobbles on the street in a sort of stylized way. And once all that's gone through, I'll go into the acrylic pens just to do some sort of precise points. I mean, in many ways, when you use an acrylic pen, specifically a brush pen, it's very much like using a brush with a very sort of reliable paint on it, in that it can be used as part of the same sort of mental process, the same technique. Some people are surprised that I sort of so happily use a brush pen and watercolour brush in the same sketch process, and I do it unthinkingly. I don't mean unthinkingly, but I do it without any pause for caution or concern. You know, it's like, obviously they're all the same thing. It's a brush, and it's got a colour in it. What's not to like? It's kind of feels like very natural friends, these two techniques, more than many. You know, in terms of when people use different sort of styles and techniques, more than fountain pens and watercolours. There's an obvious connection between the acrylic brush pen. And it just has the ability to be very precise, you know, more precise than me with brush is the brush pen. But still, a brush pen is a kind of line that's never going to be sort of micro thin. It's never going to be the ultimate thinness. So it's always going to feel brushy. I mean, of course it is, it's a brush pen, but that's how it connects. Now, getting towards the latter stage of this sketch, and I think we can agree, you and I, when we first saw that sort of pinky beigey colour going down, it looked awful, didn't it? That kind of blotchy bobbliness. And now when we look at the drawing, that's kind of the best bit, because it gives that kind of plastered wall surface a sort of, I don't know, an integrity. It's got kind of a quality to it that feels interesting. And what now looks awful is that sky, because the sky doesn't need to have that texture. That's, I guess, where that kind of watercolour or ink on Yupo has a failing. I think I would need to use a more opaque, meaning a more solid colour on that sky, or perhaps paint the same sky multiple times to sort of even out the brush strokes. And of course, it's still wet at the moment, so that's difficult for me to do here. That would be the kind of thing I'd have to do later on after everything had dried off. So good lesson learned there. Now, throughout this Germany trip, I've been exploring what I consider to be kind of monotone, meaning very limited ranges of colours. 3 or 4 of the sketches I've done have been kind of in the blues or in the kind of warms, in the yellows, and trying to sort of minimise the variation of colours. The reason I'm doing that is twofold. Firstly, it's speedier. So I could mix a little puddle of this sort of creamy render colour, plaster colour, and within, 2 minutes, I've got the majority of these forms in place, and they're all the right kind of feel, and they connect with each other nicely, and it's quick. So number one, it's quick. Number two, it's harmonious. It has this sense of coherence. It fits with itself, obviously, because it's all the same colour. So it's a very easy way of making an image that feels intentional, is by limiting the amount of colours you use. Try it. Normally when you got those watercolour sets you buy, and you open them up and they've got 57 colours in them, and you spend your whole time mixing little bits of yellow and little bits of purple and little bits of green, and it all gets very bitty and very broken. There's something, it breaks apart. The image sort of is just a whole series of things you've done, and it doesn't feel coherent. And just try doing it with 3 colours, that just using exactly the same technique you would do, multiple colours, but just the act of using a limited range of colours will create this connection between these different forms in a way that harmonises. And it will also speed your process, because if you start with the assumption that you're going to be using a limited palette, you start by saying, well, I don't care whether that's, that shade of lilac, or I say it every time, if my concern is precision, I'll take a photograph, because photographs are beautiful things. They are an art form that we can all respect and love. So take a photograph if precision is your goal. If you want a connection and you've still got to have lunch, and you can't be sitting on the ground. This is sitting on the ground, getting too old for this. It gets silly, you get sore and tired. So you have to be quick, and that's what an urban sketch is. It's not called urban art, it's urban sketch. So it has to have an element of speed to it, so and looseness and freedom, and that limited palette, that's a big part of that speed and that freedom. So do try that. If it's one of the only things you pick up from these videos, the limited palette should be one of those things. That and go big. Me, I'm a massive fan. I want the whole world to draw bigger. I just get, oh my heavens. You see these people doing these little tiny drawings, like literally the size of postcards, or even smaller. Oh, it makes my shoulders ache. Turning my shoulders as I'm saying this, moving them in that relaxed way so that I feel ready. And that's how I would approach the sketch. I'm kind of limbering up and loosening up so I can kind of relax my arm into this act of creatively getting this image down. Anyway, I've been wittering on. Thank you so much for listening, especially if you listened all the way to the end. Bless you. See you next time.